Hey everybody, welcome back once again to the Retro Game Fix Retro Jones podcast number 80. This is your host Mitch.
And this is Mike.
And today we're doing things a little bit differently. We have a special guest, the author, among many, many other things, of the great book Console Wars, Blake J. Harris. Blake, how's it going?
It is wonderful, guys. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. So we're pretty excited to talk to you today. We've, when the book came out, I guess we were day one people, purchasing it, and it was a great read, and definitely have some questions about that. Definitely interested in a little bit of what you've been doing lately. I see that you have a new book that you're working on that is kind of also right up our alley that we would like to talk about, if that is possible. Go ahead.
Before I write any project, I like to ask myself, what would Mike and Mitch think of this? So,
well, of course. These are all obviously all these issues are very dear to our heart, especially the VR stuff. I mean, obviously the retro gaming stuff, that's a given, but the VR stuff is something we've talked about at length. So we appreciate you considering us when considering what your next project would be. So why don't we get started? Why don't we go ahead and start off a little bit? Can you tell us a little bit about you and kind of, where you grew up, what your early gaming memories were, what games are dear to you, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So I grew up in New York, in Westchester, a suburb outside of the city, and I got my first console was an NES. I'm 33 years old, so I think I was probably 6 or 7 at the time.
Sure.
I can't remember exactly which Christmas I got it, but I remember my brother and I opened this thing up, and I remember being so excited, but also not really knowing what it did. I just knew that everyone wanted a Nintendo, as we so non-specifically called it. Everyone wanted a Nintendo, and it's kind of a bummer when you're a kid that you can't play with the thing immediately because, you need to plug it in and whatnot. And then finally when we went home and played it hours later, it was the greatest thing ever. And, so many, like a lot of people, and I'm sure you guys, a ton of my great childhood memories are playing the NES. And also, those are the only memories I have of my brother. That's the only time I would ever play with my brother. I was a jerk to him. I'm an older brother. We've become good friends. But really, at the time, that was what connected us. And that's was partly what fascinated me and made me interested in writing Console Wars, was that it was about a time of gaming where the phrase or the word gamer didn't even really exist. It was if you were a kid, you played video games. I mean, what else? You couldn't go to a bar and drink, or go to a sports game. That was what you did. That was it was the social lubricant of our time. And so, we loved the NES. Favorite games would include, Super Mario 3 is probably my favorite game of all time. Mm-hmm. But Zelda definitely is the one I spent the most time on. I was always really into sports games, and there were some good baseball games for the NES, but I probably didn't really get too much into that until the next console I got. And so my brother and I, this must have been in 1991, the year that the Super Nintendo was coming out. And in the months leading up to it, my brother and I put together the childhood equivalent of a PowerPoint presentation to be we need to get the Super Nintendo. We, why not? For $200, this thing that we've been playing with for 4 years is now better.
Absolutely.
I distinctly remember my father saying no, and his reason was that basically, a few years from now, Nintendo would come with the Super Duper Nintendo and the Super Super Duper Nintendo, and I guess it really comes back to the backward compatibility issue, because otherwise he wouldn't care that much. And so that too is part of what made me end up wanting to write the book. Well, I should say that as a loophole, my parents got us the Genesis. Somehow that was an exemption. And then
I noticed a lot of pictures because a lot of the pictures that I've seen, the one on Console Wars and stuff, you have a Genesis controller. So I was just assuming that was probably your system.
Oh yeah. I shouldn't flash forward just yet. Yeah. So we got a Genesis. My brother actually got it for his birthday. So it always but he's a younger brother and he let me play, and it was what we did together. And so I loved sports games. NBA Jam, NHL '94 is my one of my favorite games, if not my favorite game of all time. Maybe Super Mario Brothers 3 has to move over. So that was a sweet spot in my childhood, playing all those games. And also, I had friends with the Super Nintendo, so that always worked out nicely, going back and forth, and also participating in the rivalry at recess about which system was better, or talking about it in school. So it was, I always really thought of Sega Nintendo as a big part of my life. And then probably around the time I turned 13 or 14, after I got the first PlayStation, which was the next console, I stopped playing it, and I didn't really play video games for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then in like maybe 2010, my brother got me a Genesis for my birthday because he had asked me, he wanted to get me a good gift and asked what was the best gift I ever got. And I said, I think it was the Genesis, even though that was your gift. Right. So he got it for me. And I expected that it would bring back a flood of memories, happy memories. And sure. I had ordered NHL 94 off of eBay. So it was like, it was like riding on a bike again. It was so fun. But what I didn't expect was that I'd be so curious to try to figure out what had happened. Why I stopped playing video games, and also what had been going on behind the scenes. And so I ended up going to a Barnes & Noble and looking for the video game history section, and there was no such section. And right. The woman pretty much laughed at me. And I said, all right, well, then, can I just get one of the books on Sega and Nintendo, or, like the history of video games, business of video games. And there was nothing. And there wasn't even anything that she tried to order whenever they tried to do that thing, we can order if you can have it here in 7 days. And right. So I was kind of shocked. And that's not to say that there are books like that don't exist, because there are some, and some good ones, like David Sheff's Game Over. I really like Harold Goldberg's book. But it was just odd to me that in a gigantic 3-story Barnes & Noble, there wasn't a single book on video games that was not a walkthrough guide.
You know what? We've been there. We've totally been there. So anyways, yeah. I'm sorry. Continue.
No. And so, I didn't leave Barnes & Noble thinking that there had been some eureka moment of aha, that's what I'm going to do. Right. But it definitely set me on the path to just try to scratch my own itch of that curiosity of what did happen? Why is it so hard to find? And then even just searching online, there were so few stories about Sega. There was I read Game Over, which chronicles the rise of Nintendo from in Japan in '83 and in America in '85, basically through the '80s. And then the book was written in '93, and it kind of ends with there was this threat Sega that has been squashed, and who knows what the future brings with the World Wide Web and multimedia. And so it was, in a way, I was kind of viewed my book as a sequel to that, because I felt like it was getting to the most interesting part, and then it ended. But even online, as I was saying, if I search, I couldn't find anything about Sega from 1990 to 96. All I found was that Nintendo had 90 to 95% of the market. Then Sega came in and everything changed. And I was like, well, what changed? What happened? And so I ended up speaking with the people and then having a long conversation with Tom Kalinske. And that after that conversation with Tom was when I had the firm feeling of wow, I definitely really need to do this. And it took me a while to do, but it definitely changed my life in a wonderful way in so many ways. I had been trading commodities at the time as my day job, trading sugar and coffee and stuff. And, needless to say, that wasn't my first option for what I wanted to be doing. I had wanted to write for a long time, and that's what I am now able to do. And,
awesome.
We'll talk more about the VR stuff. But so that's kind of how I started with the book.
Oh, awesome. Well, the funny thing is a couple things stand out to me about that, too, because we're about the same age. All of us, Mike and I are 34, so just a year older. So, everything happened about the same time back then. I know both of us, we were super privileged now that we look at it as far as what we got. I had my dad was actually a gamer back then, which was great. And my brother was a gamer back in the day. And, so one Christmas we got and the funny story before that is that 2 weeks before Christmas, I knew I was getting an NES because I could hear underneath my bedroom, I could hear my dad playing Mario Brothers. I could hear the theme song from Mario Brothers. So I knew for 2 weeks before whatever Christmas that was that I was getting that. And it just so happens that same Christmas, my brother got a Sega Master System. So, Yeah, so I mean, like that was probably the greatest Christmas ever, I would say. And Mike had an NES, and he also had a uncle. You had an uncle that worked at Tonka, right?
Yeah, well, it's actually my grandpa worked at Tonka, and at that time, I think they were either still doing some Sega distribution or, maybe that relationship had just ended. But yeah, one day he stopped over and was like, here's a Sega Master System in like 30 games, some of the card games. And I was like, at the time, I didn't even have a Nintendo. So from that kind of jump street, I was kind of inherently a Sega guy. But then, yeah, I ended up getting the NES later too. So kind of had some blessed childhoods of just like, hey, we got both of them.
Well, we actually became friends over video games as well. When we were both 6 years old, we actually bonded over the Ninja Turtles game, Ninja Turtles 1 for the NES. So we've been friends ever since. So we have the most exclusive gaming club of all time, which is just the two of us. So one of the most exclusive. But so a couple of things. It's funny. You said sports games. Was RBI up on your list? RBI baseball on the original NES? Yeah, that was.
I still play that on my iPad. On this.
I play it on anything I can, basically anything I can play it on. It's still one of my favorite games of all time. I'd say it's probably in like my top 5, but we were, big into the sports games and stuff like that as well. So that's pretty cool. Well, it's cool too to listen. It was reading this book. It was just basically like, wow, somebody's filling in like what happened behind the scenes when of my childhood, because video gaming like was my childhood. It was Mike's childhood as well. I mean, we'd be over at each other's house every single weekend playing video games or renting video games if we didn't quite have, whatever the newest game was at the time. So it was fascinating. There were a lot of points in this book where I was just like, those facts are like extremely like compelling to me. So and we'll elaborate on that just a little bit more in a bit. But so kudos to you for scraping up this information. But there's a lot of questions that I have, and there's a lot of questions that Mike has too. And we only have, so we definitely don't want to take up your entire night. But so if you don't mind, we'll just ask you a few questions here. Sound good?
Well, yeah. I mean, as you can tell, console wars changed my life. So I pretty much love talking about any aspect of it, so I'm happy to answer anything.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, a lot of it had to do I don't know. We'll just start asking questions here, and we'll get to as much as we want. But there are a lot of questions when you're interviewing somebody that it's like, we feel like we should ask these questions or something like that. But these questions, I'm deeply like, I really want to know about, So, just a couple things from me that like off the top of my head. So a couple of things I thought were absolutely fascinating. One was when, was it Olaf Olafsson that was the director of entertainment for Sony?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Like the story about when he had gone to, I guess they were going to unveil the peripheral for the Super Nintendo, like the CD peripheral. And then basically Nintendo totally like punched him in the nuts and was like, was it Panasonic that they were going to, that they had, I guess, switched it with? Because I know that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that story? Can you give us a little bit of detail on that one?
So originally, Nintendo was at the CES show in the summer of 1991, when Nintendo was coming out with the Super Nintendo, and they were going to announce a CD attachment. They had made a deal with Sony that Sony would be the partner in that, and they didn't tell Sony that they were no longer the partner until a press conference. So they found out that way. And yeah, Olaf Olafsson was the head of Sony at the time. And one thing that was kind of hard for me to like wrap my head around, since we all know what Sony means to the video game industry now. I mean, they're just, dominance aside, they are a hardware maker. That's how we think of them. So it was kind of like, and I knew that by the end of the story they were a hardware maker, but it's kind of weird, or it was hard to kind of get in the mindset of like they were really a software company. Like it would be the equivalent of if like nowadays if Electronic Arts came out with hardware. So all of their relations with Sega and Nintendo prior to mid 90, like 93 or so, and because this attachment part failed, like they were really just this software company, and not a very good one and not a very respected one. So that's part of why Nintendo, I guess, didn't have a problem with publicly snubbing them. And Olaf went through it, and speaking with Olaf was actually changed a lot of my view on the book, because I got a chance to meet with him. He was definitely someone who was a little harder to get in touch with, and he was the head of Sony Publishing Entertainment at the time, which was the software division, and I asked him about that day when he got snubbed, and I'd heard secondhand stories that, like, he was so angry and pissed off, and he was that to some degree, but there was also a sense of like relief and a sense of vengeance, because he hated Nintendo. And I guess just to hear his perspective, like the fact that the story that I've been told so many times from other people, and it felt a little bit differently when he described it, it changed my viewpoint, because he also used the word he described Nintendo's treatment of Sony as being treated like slaves on a plantation, which was like language I would never use myself. But like, I was like, wow, he really felt that strongly, and that spawned this whole thing. And it reminded me a lot of Game of Thrones, where everyone just has a different perspective of the story, and they all believe that they're like the rightful heirs to this throne, and they all have a somewhat compelling case. And that was how I really started to see Sega, Nintendo, and Sony as companies with different philosophies, and all think that they deserved it for different reasons. But there could only be one, I guess.
Interesting. Well, that was one of the most interesting, and you'll have to excuse me too, because I read the book right when it came out, and I was going to kind of breeze up on it before we had gotten in here, or before we had gotten in touch with you. But so I'm kind of pulling some of these from my memory as far as that goes. But that was one of the most fascinating things, where I was like, oh my God, because you look at some of the stuff that Nintendo did, like when they like tried to blacklist stores like Walmart or different stores for carrying Sega products or whatever, when they tried to shorten their supply or whatever that was, like all these things were like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe it, but I can totally believe it. So and clearly, by the way, to all of our listeners out there, this is all in the book. So I'm just kind of bringing up a couple parts here. In fact, the book just came out on paperback recently, right? Correct.
Yeah, it came out. The book came out in hardcover in May of 2014, and then it came out in paperback. Yeah. And it's always been an audiobook. A lot of people, I've never listened to the audiobook, but a lot of people seem to like it that way. And Fred Berman did an excellent job from the parts I have listened to.
Yeah, and actually I will mention too, on my way home from work this evening, I stopped and picked up 2 copies of the paperback at a local Barnes & Noble. Hey. And I will give those away on Twitter after this podcast as well. So, in the spirit of the interview, I wanted to go pick up a couple copies and get that into the hands of people that, if miraculously they haven't read it, they need to. So...
And plus, we'll obviously throw a link to Amazon up there as well. But it is a fantastic read. There's a lot I want to kind of ask you about as far as this goes, but I'm going to hog the entire podcast. Mike, why don't you go ahead and I know you got questions too.
Yeah, well, you'd mentioned, maybe some difficulty getting in touch with Olaf Olafsson. My question, when you started this, kind of the process. Reading through the book, obviously there's a lot of great information from Nintendo and Sega, but it really seems like you got quite a bit more candid access to Sega. Mm-hmm. Was that by design, or really kind of just based on how things played out, throughout the process?
That's an excellent question, and that was a big part of the whole process, was figuring out what to do about that, and but unsurprisingly, given what you just described about Nintendo. Maybe threatening Walmart and the antitrust litigation that followed, they were not the easiest company to get access to speak with their employees. And also, unlike Sega, who operated much more like a Silicon Valley company where there's some turnover and you're not there for too many years. Nintendo, it was much more the Japanese model, where if you work there, you kind of work there for life. So the people I still wanted to interview were either there or had left a few years ago. So that was very hard. So to answer your question, I would say that, like, my earliest vision of the book was that, like, it would be one chapter kind of Sega focused, one chapter Nintendo focused, and back and forth like that. And but that was before I really knew too much of the story. And then it took, I was able to speak with some people earlier on, and at least get a sense of what Nintendo was like. But I definitely had much better access, and many more employees from Sega that I spoke with. So the first half of the book did did unintentionally at first skew more that way.
Mm-hmm.
But then as I got more of the information of Nintendo and I kind of saw where they were coming from, their reason for a lot of these practices that might seem unfair or unnecessary, their reasoning was because they had fought in their own kind of David and Goliath battle 5 years earlier, and the reason why that had happened was because of the crash of Atari due to not having quality control, and I could at least see where they were coming from. So I kind of wanted the reader to go through the same process I did, where for like 2 years I heard that these guys were like evil, and then I spoke to them, and it wasn't like they're like waking up in the morning thinking, how can we be evil? They were like, how can we do what's best for the consumer in the long run? And I will say that I've bought lots of stuff from Nintendo over the years, and I don't think I've ever bought anything I didn't love, and that's the only company I could say that about. So there is some value to their obsessive and sometimes frustrating closed system and, meticulous control. So I could at least appreciate that. So I did bring more of Nintendo into the first half of the story as I learned more, but it was by design at that point that I wanted the reader to kind of go through the process that I felt where maybe they weren't so bad after all. Yeah. And but, at the same time, one fun thing for me was that even though 20 years had passed, when I spoke with people from Nintendo, they still hated the people from Sega and vice versa.
Oh, wow.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so I was going to say, so like when I write anything really of like narrative nonfiction, I try to write it as like some sort of hybrid between like me and the author and the character themselves, so you feel like you're inside their head a little bit. And so when I wrote the Nintendo stuff, I hated Sega. And when I wrote the Sega stuff, I hated Nintendo, or at least tried to inhabit how they felt at the time, which was generally that.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you say that because, there's kind of this meta story, and I don't know if this resonated with other people, but reading the book, the console war aspect of it was fascinating to me, but really almost just the inner workings of two companies and just almost this war of marketing among the two of them. It would have been almost interesting, at least the way you presented it, regardless if it was Sega and Nintendo. I mean, that was really kind of the enjoyable part, was almost this game of cat and mouse and reading through the book and going, wow, they really didn't like each other, and it was just really this game of chess of how can they outposition each other, and it was fascinating.
That was interesting, but not only that, but Sega and Sega of Japan as well.
Yeah.
So it was almost like Sega was competing with themselves. I was going to ask real quick to kind of piggyback on the last question that Mike had. Did you have? I'm assuming you probably had less contacts in the Sega of Japan, but did you ever have any like discrepancy between what Sega of Japan had said and what Sega of America had said, or did they pretty much tell the same story?
Well, first I just want to say thanks for that previous comment about you still would have enjoyed it if it wasn't Sega Nintendo. My one goal that I remember telling my manager a bunch of times was that like I felt to me the story was that I was like hearing from these people would have been 90% as interesting if it was rival tissue companies. Like right. I was like,
Yep.
It's just a bonus that it happens to be this thing that dominated my childhood. So I really lucked out with writing a great story, and I wanted to make sure that kind of universal sense was there. So I'm glad that paid off. And the answer to your question about discrepancies between Sega of America and Sega of Japan is really, I didn't have that much access to Sega of Japan. And I think it's kind of clear from the story that most of it comes from the Sega of America point of view. Mm-hmm. I did get to have a very strange long meeting with Hayao Nakayama and have been in touch with him. But for the most part, I was denied access to other people. And the strange thing to me was that in the end, whereas most of the book is, more in favor of Sega, or at least focused on Sega than Nintendo.
The underdog
I would say
story.
Nintendo, yeah, the underdog story. But Nintendo kind of comes out looking pretty good at the end, and at least also the people from Nintendo seem to really respect my approach to telling the story, and my persistence to speak with them. So by the end, they were like I had a very high opinion, and they were helpful. Their PR and communications department. The next E3, I got to meet with Reggie. Like they were great to me. And Sega, they wouldn't talk to me because I guess Sega of Japan won that battle and Sega Control. And I was told secondhand, but that like nobody at Sega was supposed to talk about the book, or like it was just like they basically just ignored it. So I guess it makes sense, though. When I wrote it, I always imagined like, wow, Sega, I'm sure they'll like support this, and
I would think so. You would think after reading the book, like Sega, Sega looks great in that book. I mean, the story is compelling, but like, yeah, I would think that they would, be patting you on the back. Thank you, Yes. So, but yeah, well, I wonder if it's a cultural thing too, as far as like the closed. Like we don't want to, we don't want anybody talking about our business or previous business and all that stuff.
I'm sure it is. Like when I first met with the head of corporate communications at Nintendo, she flew out to New York and we had dinner, and that was like when things started to change. She saw where I was coming from, that kind of like realized like, hey, I'm getting paid the same amount to write this book, whether it's about Nintendo or not. But right now it's all from your competitor's point of view, and I personally care about telling a better story and getting the complete picture. So they started to really understand that where I was coming from, and I guess read other, trusted in me to do it. And they said during the meeting that part of the reason for resistance in general with the press is because, as explained to me, like in Japanese business culture, you don't want to single out individuals. And so the idea of like writing a story about like with people with names, it's not just saying like Nintendo, it's like this guy did this and this guy did that. That's not something that they want to do. But, and so Sega being a Japanese company, I could see that being the same thing too. But one other thing I should mention is that while I was in the process of researching the book before I wrote it, and I think that this was probably in like late 2011, myself and Jonah Tulis, myself and my business partner Jonah Tulis, who's co-directing the documentary with me, we were hired by Sega of America to go to shoot 10 short documentaries for something they called the Heritage Collection. They were re-releasing old games like Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, House of the Dead 3 and 4, and because this was like games that consumers had potentially purchased in the past, they wanted to add some additional value. So like they described it as like a Criterion collection. So they wanted like this behind the scenes documentary for these different games. And since all the games were created in Japan, they flew us to Japan, and we were within Sega of Japan and met with these people. And it's been 20 years since the story happened, so it's not fair to say that what I experienced or saw at Sega of Japan is exactly what it was like for Tom and Al and the others. But I felt a lot of what they felt. I felt that Sega Japan went out of their way to make things more difficult. Like small examples would just be like, we brought like a ton of lights, and it was like it took like an hour to set things up, and they had to switch rooms for every interview, and like so we just basically lost an hour and lost all this time. They wouldn't tell us. We sent questions in advance, and they wouldn't tell us if they were approved. They wouldn't tell us how long the interviews were going to be. So it was just things that like. Maybe they had legitimate reasons. I don't understand why.
Well, I'll tell you this. My mother-in-law is Japanese, and that sounds right. It sounds about right. Actually, I should have said that a little softer, but yeah, no. I mean, I obviously like I love her to death, but a lot of those things kind of ring a bell. Maybe it is a cultural thing,
Well, so. But I guess maybe I explained it badly. Like I think that it was, but like I think that it wasn't a cultural thing like that. At some point, I felt like they just went out of their way to not help Sega of America.
Yeah,
and maybe that was other stuff I saw on the ground there where it was like, there's no way as an outsider I would have thought these are two people from the same company that
of course
have a similar interest. And that's so ridiculous because we were hired by Sega of America to shoot and talk about how awesome these things that were made in Sega of Japan were. Like it was a win-win for both sides.
Yeah, of course.
It was the whole thing was really frustrating, but I guess that gave me some decent insight to that. And during that trip, I got to meet with Nakayama-san, which was awesome.
That's so cool. Like that's just that whole like adventure, like the whole process of, interviewing everybody. I would just eat that up. I mean, that had to have been just an amazing experience, the entire thing. So.
It was, and I'd never interviewed anybody before, so that was a good learning process.
Kind of just jumped on it and were like, yeah, this is going to be fun, and just learned on your way.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Fake it till you make it.
and so that's kind of I was never trained by anybody, and so maybe that's why I have adopted a style. I never prepare questions in advance. I like to just have a conversation like the three of us are having instead of
Yeah.
like scripting it with a Q&A. And it's worked out very well. And but it was definitely a situation I felt like that sometimes maybe just because of the subject matter, but it mirrored Sega's, where it's like I almost succeeded because I didn't realize what I was getting into. Like I didn't realize I was going to be interviewing over 200 people and interviewing the main people so many times, but it was just like that curiosity kept driving me. And had I known, I maybe would have shrunken the scope a little bit. But so it was good that I didn't know. And it was a great learning process. I have since interviewed lots of people. The new book is interview based. Everything I do is interview based. I love telling stories based on firsthand experiences. So it was a life-changing process for me in a lot of ways.
So do you still go in? You'd mentioned that you kind of went in with not a real hard Q&A. You just kind of went into it and were like, hey, let's talk it out. So do you still do that now, even with your most recent projects, where it's like, hey, there's kind of a light idea of what we're going to talk about, but let's just have a conversation and we'll go from there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I don't mean to sound like I go in unprepared.
No. And I didn't mean to imply that. I was just
no, you didn't imply that at all.
Sure.
If anyone was listening and thinking like, oh, that's so much easier, I should just do the not like in the case of early on with the Sega stuff, it was partly just a byproduct of like what could I have prepared. Like I didn't know enough about what the story was to ask specific questions.
Sure.
But and this now, whether it's for the pieces I write for the How Did This Get Made on movies, or whether it's stuff for the VR book, I definitely make sure that I'm knowledgeable of the subject, but I want it to feel like a conversation, and I would almost feel like it would just be like play acting if I'm asking questions. Like I feel like I should just email them if that's what we're going to do. I want to just have a conversation. I want to get to know them because who knows what is going to actually make it into the book. And like one of my favorite parts of Console Wars is when is Al Nilsson's story about fugu in Japan, and using that story about how he was willing to eat the deadly fish as like as a metaphor for what Sega of America was willing to do and what Sega of Japan was afraid to do. And that wouldn't have I can't imagine that ever being the answer to any question I would have prepared ahead of time. That was just from Al and I talking and me getting to know him and sharing stories about Sega and not Sega and life and stuff like that. And so, I feel like that's how I get the stuff that I'm looking for and that I'm interested in.
Awesome. Well, anybody out there, if we haven't mentioned it already, I know we have, but any of our listeners out there, pick up a copy of Console Wars. It's awesome. Again, like I said, I mean, the story's great, but everything about it is awesome. And one of the things that was really compelling to me was just the information. I was like, oh my God, this is what was going on behind the scenes. But again, Mike picked up a couple copies. I guess one of which we'll be giving away on Twitter after this, and also we'll post the link on there. But pick it up. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, you pretty much have to own a copy of this. So yeah, of course. So I know you've been super busy as of late. Can you kind of tell us a little bit? I know you had mentioned the. If you don't mind transitioning a little bit, because I noticed we're on like 35 minutes or something, so we want to get as much as we can as far as that goes, if you're okay with that. Yeah. But we know you're a busy guy as far as this goes. One of the things you had mentioned is the I guess the film adaptation of Console Wars. I had kind of tried to read a little bit about it, and I couldn't really find a lot of information on that. Like, is it a documentary, or is there actually like going to be because I know I'd read somewhere that it's going to be like a documentary, and then there's like a full feature length. Like, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So we're doing both, and we have been for a while. We shot all of the stuff for the documentary, most of it while I was writing the book, and we have just been in post on it, and it's coming along great. The problem, if anything, is my fault because I got much more involved with the VR book. But Seth Rogen is is writing and directing the feature film. He's
Mm-hmm.
also been producing the documentary that I'm doing directing with Jonah, and Scott Rudin is producing both as well. And Scott produced Social Network and Moneyball and a lot of other things, but those two in particular were inspirations for me, or the books
Wow.
that inspired them were inspirations for me.
Yeah.
So, it's like a lot of things in Hollywood, it moves slower than you want sometimes, but
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't imagine having better partners than them, and we're doing it with the feature films with Sony. They extended the option back in November, so everyone is still interested. We're still moving forward as planned, and hopefully, I'll be finishing up the VR book this year, and hopefully we'll be able to finish up the documentary too, and or at least if not during the end of the year, I'll be able to turn my full attention to it after that. But it's awesome. Like I intentionally, it was very important because of kind of the way I described like how Barnes and Noble didn't even have a book on video games. Like it was very important to me that Console Wars be a book that was accessible to anybody, whether you played games during that era or just played them now, or whether you never picked up a controller at all. Like I always thought of my grandmother in mind as the ideal reader. So it was really important to me that the book not necessarily rely on nostalgia and not necessarily rely on like your knowledge of certain things. And I think that you will feel that nostalgic feeling if you go through it because you'll remember it. But like I wanted to tell a universal story, but with the documentary, it's so great because we can be a little bit more specific, or we can show you a commercial and kind of like leverage all these actual artifacts that I never wanted to go into too much detail describing in the book because I didn't want to like alienate anyone, or at least have them be confused about what I was trying to describe or why it was important. And so it was really cool to kind of tell the same story, but with in a different medium and also much shorter since the book is 550 pages.
Right.
Your listeners should be warned of that at least. And a documentary, is going to be like an hour and a half.
Yeah, but the book being 500 and some pages, it's one of those that you get to the end and you're kind of sad, It's like, I want there to be more, So, anyway, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, and also, even though that might sound like a lot, and it was definitely a lot to write, my goal going in was like, I wanted this book to be as dense as Disney War, which was a book about the behind the scenes of Disney. So as dense as Disney War, but read as quickly as Da Vinci Code. So I wanted it to kind of be like a page turner. And some people hate that about the book, but to me that was really important, that like to get in 500 pages worth of information, but have it be framed in a way that like you're just blowing by it and not even realizing that you're picking up information.
That's a good description. That's exactly how I describe it. So awesome. Cool. Well, I can't wait to hear more about the film adaptation, the documentary, and all that. So, tell us a little bit. I looked on your website about the book, and it was The History of the Future is the name of it.
Yep.
Okay. So, tell me the details on that. When is that coming out?
So that is definitely, we know the date for that. So that's coming out in May of next year.
Okay,
so
great.
Year.
Okay.
And and so it's funny because I was telling someone the story today. In a way, the main characters from Console Wars, Tom Kalinske, the president, Al Milson, the marketing guy, were partially involved with pushing me in this direction.
Really?
Kind of the first thing that happened after Console Wars was, when looking for what to write about next, was that it was really hard to find something. I spent 3 years of my life working on Console Wars, and it was, even if I did other things, that was like, you can ask my girlfriend, that was like my essence of it. Like that was all I thought about. That was, it was a really big commitment, and that's what made it so rewarding. But now going in, kind of knowing what it takes to write a book and what my life will be like, thinking like, wow, do I really want to spend like 2 years or 3 years on this? Do I really want to like spend every day? And I lucked out with having such great people that I was speaking with all the time, not even just Sega people, but I love talking to Howard Lincoln and Gail Tilden and Peter Main. So it was like, I was a little bit wary of like, what is a story that's potentially going to be as interesting as this, that has, that it has like characters in it that I want to be as fascinated by. And so what I was telling someone earlier today was I was exploring the idea of maybe writing about Rovio, who does Angry Birds, and in the same way that like Sega and Nintendo was about the birth of the modern console industry, and the transition from the video games being Wild West to like an industry, I was thinking like, oh, this could be like a good, story about mobile gaming and smartphones and all that stuff. And that's not to say that such a book wouldn't be good, but I remember at the E3 video game trade show in 2014, it was like a couple months after the book had come out, I was sitting with Tom Kalinske and Al and Michael Kiraz, who's the son of Cheryl Kiraz, who's mentioned in the book. She worked at the radio station that worked with Sega back in the day. And I was telling Tom and Al and like what I was thinking about for potentially next book, and how I was going to meet with someone from Rovio, and they were like, I don't know. And I was like, I care about your opinion so much.
You're like, what do you mean? I was really excited about this one.
It's deflated.
Yeah. And like, I wanted to be like, part of me wanted to be like, yeah, it's just because it's not about you that you guys think, But then I'm like, these guys are, they're like kind of my heroes.
Especially Tom Kalinske too. I would listen to what he has to say for sure.
Well, it's like, all right. I mean, they were friendly about it, but they were. I could tell that their eyes didn't light up, and I was like, damn. And I was like, I know this is why I'm never gonna write a book as Console Wars. I'm never gonna find a subject matter. I was like, the one I really want to write about is virtual reality, because I had tried VR the year. I tried the Oculus DK1 the year before at E3, and again that year. And I was like, that could have the same impact on culture and pop culture and entertainment and technology as Sega and Nintendo, and basically it just be about this mainstream thing that spins out of video games. And Tom and I were like, oh yeah, yes, that's what you should write about.
There you go.
And I was like, yeah, but I was like, the success of Console Wars to me was largely due to the access and to being able to tell these character stories and make it about more than just like an encyclopedic retelling, but to actually, relive the story or recreate the story on the page. And I think Oculus, to anyone familiar with the company, knows that there's a potentially compelling narrative in Palmer Luckey being a 19-year-old kid who is the founder of this company and invents the Rift, and it leads to all this stuff, of course, with the help of other people. But, he's a pretty good entry point into the story. And I was doubtful that I'd be able to get in touch with him, or at least be able to make that happen. And Michael, who was sitting there, said, oh, well, I've spoken to him because he was at NICO and he had some conversation with Palmer. And he's like, I can introduce you by email. And I was like, well, yeah, hey, let's try. Why not? And so this was the summer of 2014, and Palmer wrote back a few weeks later and said that, unsurprisingly, other people had expressed interest in writing about Oculus and about virtual reality. Yeah. And he said that in a very kind way. And that they, also at this point, while the company had been successful, they had recently sold to Facebook for $2 billion. Or maybe, I guess, they had a lot of highlights. He didn't think they were successful yet because they hadn't actually shipped a consumer product. He felt like it was premature to try to celebrate that success or to really, were they worthy of a book? What had they really even accomplished? And I thought that was pretty mature for a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old at the time. And so he said, basically implied like, well, but maybe in a few years let's chat. And he said, but I did really love Console Wars, and a lot of people here at Oculus did too. So tell me what your thoughts are about this being like presumptuous. And I wrote him a long email, and it was a really good question that made me think about like, why do I want to do this? It can't just be for my own personal benefit, my own personal like I'm curious thing. Why should readers want to know about it now and not 5 years from now? Why should Oculus be interested in helping? And a lot of my thoughts came down to the idea that in the same way that I remember as kids, like when we would get these consoles, and maybe it was partly because they were from Japan, but it always felt like these things kind of came out of thin air. Like I didn't know the story behind them. Like I didn't know about Tom Kalinske. It didn't even occur to me that there was a guy like Tom Kalinske, that someone was making decisions about things. And I thought that because VR is such a new technology or a new again technology, right. I told Palmer as part of my thoughts that, when the Rift comes out, player 1 will be ready, but players 2 through mom are going to be skeptical or not aware of it. So my thought was that it would be great to put a human face on the story or put human face on the story. So, people like my mom will realize like, oh, wow, this, like, here's why people are doing this. Here's why people are, spending so much time and taking such a big risk on this because of all this potential, and just getting to know the people involved. So we had, our conversation started there. And it did take a very long time to really kind of more officially move forward, because as I've been finding out, one of the big challenges of writing a story as it's happening, other than the narrative difficulty, is the fact you have to go through corporate communications and PR and things that I didn't really have to do in the case of Sega because nobody was affiliated with the company anymore. But my thought throughout all of it was that, like, man, this is so worth it. This is just like the biggest thing of the decade. This, whatever hoops I need to jump through, I got to do it, because if there's any chance I get to tell this story or I get to tell part of it, I got to do it. So, it ended up working out that I was able to speak with the people that I wanted at Oculus and have a dialogue there, and a lot of the other major companies as well, and third parties. And so, after a couple years of trying, things are now coming together, and it's been really awesome to see the story. And it's actually been really cool, even though it's a challenge to kind of write about something that is happening. There are a lot of benefits. Now looking back, I do wish I could have been writing console wars as it was happening, because there's just so much more that you see in the moment.
Yeah, for sure. Well, what was I going to say? What about first of all, the first comment I was going to have is that enthusiasm for it. I mean, the subject matter, you just sound really enthusiastic about VR, and like that, obviously that comes through in the writing as well. I mean, that goes without saying, but we've already told you we love VR. This was one of those things that back in the day, after like maybe in the 16-bit era, it always seemed like it was the next thing to come around the corner, you know? And we've talked about this extensively as well. Like, I thought, when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old, I mean, I thought like, wow, that's going to be so cool. I'm thinking of like Star Trek, The Next Generation with like the holodeck or something like that. I'm like, I can't wait until I can do stuff like that. And it's not that far away. And then 20 some years later, I mean, there were like the arcade game Beachhead 2000 that I remember somewhere in the 90s, like mid 90s, that you had that VR helmet and you're like on the beach on Normandy or something like that. But, that was just like, it wasn't quite there yet. And obviously with the Oculus being released and so on, I mean, we both were DK2 owners, and we were super, super, super excited because this is what we'd been waiting for like 20 some years, for as long as we could remember, really. I have no idea on how many exact years it was.
No, it was funny too, because you always got little tastes. Like if you remember back when Sega released that activator where you stood in that little octagon thing, it was like, like, oh man, this is great. If I only had a headset where I could actually be inside of Mortal Kombat. And then you fast forward to the DK1 came out, and then the DK2, and I'd use the DK1 at the time. I was like, Mitch, when these DK2s are available, we need to each get one. And man, it was like everything I imagined that it would be. That's what it was. And I was like, this is awesome. This is it.
Well, the first time I put on the headset, I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I wanted. But for me, I mean, I know they've addressed this at that point, but man, I got VR sickness like a madman. It was horrible. All my friends would come over and try it out, and they'd be like, one of my friends had this like hang gliding simulator that like he didn't know you were supposed to move it with your head. So he was just spinning around in circles as fast as it would go. And he's like, I'm perfectly fine. And I'm like about to throw up all over the place just watching it on my monitor. But so yeah, this is exciting. I mean, we've talked extensively too about like, and it really is like the next frontier in video gaming. People have to kind of figure it out. And, we would have loved to have been day one on either the Valve Vive or the Oculus or whatever. But I think we both kind of agreed we wanted to kind of work out. We want to see where it goes first, like I have full faith in it that it will. And I hate to be like that or whatever, but like, with the Oculus, man, I still have VR sickness when I think about it.
No, but it's not bad though. Like, cause I think, you can make some parallel to what you're describing and kind of the idea. Like sometimes I'll see a trailer for a TV show and I'm like, well, let's see if it makes it to season 2. And then I'll like, catch up. And like when I think that, there's some sense of guilt of like, well, but if I'm not watching it, it might not make it to season 2. But that's what's so great about this is that there is this investment being made. Like, Facebook's investment alone kind of shows that, if Oculus were to kind of just go its own and have been in this position where it's like, man, we gotta start making profit, right away, they would have made so many bad decisions. So it's like, I mean, I know that HTC's financial position is a little bit different because of the other aspects of their company, but not even just Oculus, but between Google and Samsung and whatever Apple's up to and everything else in the space, if this doesn't work, there is a possibility. I don't think that's going to happen at all, but it's possible. It's not going to happen. People aren't going to give up next year. It's going to be a long thing. And so I think, I think a lot of people in the industry, and myself included, like, or anyone, probably you guys who try it, see this as like the next big platform in the same way of like the computer revolution. And, if you think about that, it took a long time. I mean, if Apple was first successful in the late 70s, but my family still didn't own a computer until the mid 90s. And these things take time, and it's not like it becomes mainstream one day, even when it crosses over. So it's just great to know that the companies are actually willing to take that long-term commitment because they believe in it. And
that's amazing. $2 billion. Yeah.
Yeah.
God. But yeah, I've been enjoying like BlakeJHarris.com, obviously. You've got your virtual reality section on there with a bunch of different stories. That have you actually tried the Ghostbusters thing? From the Void?
Yeah, last week, right? Yeah.
It looks amazing.
It is amazing. Those guys do things right. The Void. I think almost as good as the experience is watching Aaron Paul, who plays Jesse on Breaking Bad, watching the video of him on YouTube talking about his experience with the Void, where he's just like, he can't even get the words out. He's like, that was the coolest thing ever. The Void, they have an installation at Madame Tussauds on 42nd Street in New York. It's like a 10-minute Ghostbusters hyper reality experience, and it's incredible. It's untethered, so you're walking around without connection to anything, and you're doing it with other people, and you see them in the space, and you guys go in as a team and go bust ghosts, and it really is fantastic.
It seems like, because you have the VRcade stuff on there as well, and that's also untethered, where I guess there was some Dave and Buster's had kind of demoed them. I mean, that seems like that seems like something that's becoming like a thing.
Yeah,
I guess
there's kind of a huge, a larger scope to it than just video games. I mean, you're seeing kind of these, kind of one-off experiences. Six Flags did the roller coaster, now the Ghostbusters thing. I mean, it's bigger than just, sit in your living room and put a headset on and play games. I mean, this is becoming a real engaging medium and entertainment that people are willing to pay for and go do. It's kind of an appointment entertainment if it's in your area.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see. That's the first piece that I wrote about the VR for Upload VR was about like arcades plus VR and whether this was a viable thing or just kind of looking at it. Like you said, right. VRcade had installations at Dave & Buster's, and the Void was going to be setting up, and this was their first thing to the public. And what they both said in there was kind of this idea of like, once upon a time, people went to the soda shop to socialize, and then they went to arcades and, all these things that we do to socialize. But over time, definitely over the last 2 decades of my life, people spend more and more time inside their own homes because you can get something similar to the movie experience or something similar to going to the football game. So it'll be interesting to see how much people are willing to leave their homes or how much people want to, because it's definitely a premium, incredible experience, and it's something you can do with your friends. And I like that they have put the emphasis on this not being a single isolated experience, and hopefully it will get people going out doing things. And that's why it's really cool to see what the Void is doing, because they are, the guy who designed the Ghostbusters experience is Curtis Hickman, who has a background as a magician, and so he doesn't view it as this is a video game. I mean, that's part of it, but it's like this is a entertainment installation. This is like supposed to be basically like a 10-minute illusion that is using virtual reality to help create that illusion. And
Right.
you like, I didn't mention the piece because I have a bad sense of smell, but at the end of it, there's like when you, spoiler alert, you kill the Stay Puft Ghostbuster, Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
Marshmallow Man.
Yeah. And it smells like marshmallows. So it's like there's a lot of aspects to it that play on your different senses, in addition to just what you're seeing.
That's awesome. That's to me like virtual reality is like the most exciting frontier. But and you actually brought up a really good point too. You know what? We had talked about everything extensively at this point. We're on episode 80, right? But you know,
we're since you're 6 years old, so yeah.
Yeah, basically, exactly. Yeah, we're on episode like 1 million from 6 years old. So, but you know, we were talking about like, you know, the end of the arcades, like when arcades actually ended. To me, I distinctly remember Mortal Kombat 4 in the arcade, and I picked it up on N64, like not shortly after, and it was pretty much, you know, graphically was about the same. You know, it did. The difference between the arcade machine and the N64 for me at the time was like not super.
Right.
Like not much different at that point. So you were able to, at that point, to me at least, that's when I noticed the technology started to, you know, equal that in the arcade from what you could get at home. So it kind of takes away from that need to go out, and which is sad, which sucks. But I agree with you that this could be that thing to get people back out and maybe, you know, have like an arcade-like experience. I think that's a pretty brilliant point. I love it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, to your point, like the home console business really kind of grew out of the idea of like have the experience of the arcade in your home, and it was much worse and better. And
Pac-Man.
I think even the Sega Genesis, when it first launched in '89, when it didn't do that well, it was like their campaign was like the power of your 16 bits, like the power of the arcade in your home. Like, so people really like this idea of getting the premium product that you always had to go out and do now available in your own home. And so it's interesting to see VR launch in what appears to be a different manner, like, you know, because of the Rift and the Vive and the PlayStation, like it's, you know, it's an in-home experience, but that's, you know, you do see these out-of-home experiences like the Void and VRcade, and also it's because we kind of didn't experience some of like what would have been the larger experiences. You know, it's while VR did like quote unquote die in the 90s, it's not like it didn't exist anymore. It's still used for military simulations and stuff like that. And so that's like the more expensive, grander version that would have been maybe more akin to the arcade of just like the higher premium experience. But anyway, it's really fascinating time. And I highly recommend people try VR in whatever capacity. I think that one misconception or concern that I had going into it was I thought it would be gimmicky. Like I thought it would be like maybe like 3D TV where it's like, yeah, okay, this is cool. Like, but like, it's not that cool, or it's not like cool enough that I really want to change my status quo. But it really is incredible. It really made me feel like I was somewhere else and thinking about things in a different way. And the first thought I had was that it reminded me of the Pensieve in Harry Potter, where you're walking around somewhere else's memories, this being a non-video game experience. And so like, that's kind of what it's like, the chance to be anywhere and do anything. And it's only going to get better from here.
Agreed. And again, that's what we've dreamt about since we were kids. I mean, I could pretty much anybody in our generation, if the thought had ever crossed their mind, I mean, that was like the dream. So it's really exciting for us. Again, like I wish I could have been a day one person for the Valve Vive, but like the Oculus or the Valve Vive or something, even the PSVR. But I'm just like, I know they're going to get there, and I'm totally going to jump in at that point. And we own the Oculuses and all that stuff, and it was amazing. I know it's going to be amazing. I know they fixed the problem that I had with it, but you're right. It is really exciting. This is like the next frontier. We don't know what's going to happen yet. You know, there's not like a clear path. Eventually somebody's going to come out with like the quintessential VR experience that is like everybody wants a piece of, you know, and that might already exist with the Void or the VRcade or whatever, like once more people are exposed to it. So I had no idea those things existed. So I'll be on the lookout. Obviously, I totally especially after reading about it, I'm like, I totally want that, like immediately. So anyway,
yeah, it's a great like ambassador for VR, almost like a great way to have your first experience. And people should know that like even the top tier stuff like Rift and Vive and PlayStation VR, which is really great, is not going to be on the same level as those experiences. But in the same way that like the NES was not as good as the arcade games.
No, of course.
It was pretty good. And for me, the part that I've always found very fascinating, and maybe because I really liked Ready Player One, is kind of the social aspect. Facebook bought Oculus. That was seemed like a strange decision at the time.
Right.
But their company's mission really is to connect people, and virtual reality is a fantastic way to do that. If the three of us could be having this conversation in a virtual environment and actually, like, my favorite demo so far is the Oculus Touch, is Toy Box, which uses the Oculus Touch, where you have the hand controllers, and you could actually like ping pong with someone who's not physically in the same room with you, but feels like they are because they're in the same virtual space with you, and because you could actually do stuff together. And it's only going to get better from there. But that's pretty amazing feeling to feel like you actually spent time with someone, more so than just like if you were on the phone with them or on Skype with them, but to actually feel like you're there with them when you're not physically.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's like I said earlier too. It's like the enthusiasm you have about it. That's totally going to translate into the book too. So I know. Yeah. So anyway, we're looking forward to it. By the way, is there some kind of significance to like the May releases? Because I know you said May 13th, 2014 was Console Wars.
Well, yeah. I mean, Seinfeld's the last episode was on May 14th, and I wrote my college essay about that. But no, there's no significance. HarperCollins, for whatever reason, chose it a few years ago, and then I think just timing-wise, they were like, well, it'll probably be in spring. Maybe, hey, last time was May. Maybe that looks good. So no.
You should just lie about it. Tell us a story.
Yeah.
But no, it's just a coincidence, huh?
I guess so. Basically, the answer is I didn't choose it. So
I gotcha.
Right
cool. On. Well, I know we probably got to wrap this up. You're a busy man, so when we told you we'd only keep you for an hour here, so I'm really pleased that you're able to come on our podcast today, and I'm really excited, especially about the information you gave. I'm really looking forward to the book, the new book. I'm probably going to go back and reread Console Wars because that was kind of on the docket anyways. But I'm looking forward to the movie as well.
Thanks. Well, don't hesitate to ask any questions either by email or on Twitter. I like when people ask questions about the book because I obviously love writing the book. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to come back on when the movie comes out or when the book comes out. Let's do this again.
Hey, we should definitely do this again. And let me extend this too. I haven't consulted with Mike, but remember our super, super exclusive video game club that has consisted of myself and Mike since we were 6 years old. So you're invited on my end if Mike agrees.
Yeah, I think we could make space.
You were invited to be a part of our super, super exclusive, which now consists of Mike, Mitch, and Blake.
Yeah. And Ninja Turtles, so because I go wherever they go.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks again. We appreciate it so much for you being on here. We would love to have you back in the future. Anytime you feel like talking about something, you contact us and tell us you want to be on the podcast. And since you are an official member of the exclusive club, anytime you want to come on is good with us. So for RetroGameFix.com, the Retro Jones podcast number 80. This is Mitch
and Mike and Blake
and Blake, and we'll catch you next time.